The story of the space race is usually told as a triumph of human curiosity and scientific brilliance. Rockets piercing the sky, astronauts floating above the Earth, and the moon becoming a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it set its mind to something extraordinary. Yet, when we look closer at the earliest years of this race, the picture becomes less straightforward. The first rockets capable of reaching space were also capable of delivering nuclear warheads. The scientists celebrated as pioneers of peaceful exploration had previously designed weapons of unprecedented destruction, and the moments hailed as milestones for all mankind unfolded during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, when the world stood repeatedly on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was the space race really driven by a desire to explore the universe, or was it primarily another front in a global military competition? Did science lead politics, or did military strategy shape the very direction of space exploration? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. To understand the space race, we have to begin not with astronauts or satellites, but with weapons. The technological foundation of space exploration was laid during the Second World War in Nazi Germany, where engineers developed the V-2 rocket under the direction of Wernher von Braun. The V-2 was not a scientific instrument, it was a weapon designed to strike cities from beyond the reach of conventional defenses. By 1944, these rockets were raining down on London and Antwerp, killing thousands. Yet, at the same time, they demonstrated something revolutionary. A rocket could travel beyond the atmosphere and return at immense speed. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the significance of this technology. In the scramble that followed, scientific ideals were secondary to strategic necessity. Through Operation Paperclip, the United States quietly brought von Braun and dozens of other German engineers to America, while the Soviet Union captured factories, blueprints, and specialists of its own. Each side was less interested in exploration than in what rockets could do for national security. In the late 1940s, the emerging Cold War transformed rocket development into a central military priority. Nuclear weapons had changed the nature of warfare, but delivering those weapons reliably across continents remained a challenge. Long-range bombers were vulnerable. Missiles promised something far more decisive. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, became the ultimate symbol of power. When American and Soviet scientists worked on improving rocket thrust, guidance systems, and payload capacity, they were doing so under the shadow of nuclear strategy. Official documents from both countries made this clear. Military planners spoke openly about throw weight, accuracy, and survivability, terms that had little to do with peaceful science. Space, at least initially, was not the goal, it was a proving ground. This context helps explain why the launch of Sputnik in October 1957 caused shockwaves far beyond the scientific community. Officially, Sputnik was presented by the Soviet Union as a triumph of socialist science, a simple satellite broadcasting beeps from orbit. But in Washington, it was interpreted very differently. If the Soviets could place a satellite over American territory, they could also deliver a nuclear warhead. President Eisenhower's advisors warned that the balance of power might be shifting. The fear was not about falling behind in astronomy, it was about vulnerability. Declassified National Security Council discussions show that Sputnik intensified concerns about missile gaps and national defense. Publicly, American leaders emphasized education and innovation. Privately, the military implications dominated their thinking. The American response to Sputnik reflected this dual reality. In 1958, the United States created NASA, an agency presented as civilian and peaceful, yet its origins were deeply intertwined with the Department of Defense. Many of NASA's early launch vehicles were adapted directly from military missiles, including the Redstone and Atlas rockets. Werner von Braun, once a weapons designer for Hitler's Germany, became a central figure in America's space program. His team at Huntsville had already been working on ballistic missiles for the U.S. Army before shifting focus to spaceflight. This overlap was not accidental. By separating NASA from the military on paper, the United States aimed to project an image of peaceful exploration, even as military and intelligence agencies continued parallel programs behind the scenes. Some historians argue that this separation was more about public perception than substance. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, space achievements served as instruments of psychological warfare. Each launch, each milestone was a signal to the world about technological superiority. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, the Soviet Union celebrated it as a triumph of socialist science. In the United States, the reaction was again one of alarm. President John F. Kennedy privately acknowledged that America's space efforts were less about exploration and more about global standing. In a now famous address to Congress, he framed the challenge bluntly. The United States needed to demonstrate leadership, not just for its own citizens, but for the newly independent nations watching from the sidelines of the Cold War. Kennedy's decision to commit to landing a man on the moon is often remembered as a visionary leap, yet his own words, recorded in meetings and speeches, reveal a more pragmatic calculus. He reportedly questioned the scientific value of a moon landing, but recognized its symbolic power. The moon was a target that could clearly demonstrate technological capability without directly escalating military conflict. Enormous funding that followed, at its peak consuming over 4% of the federal budget, reflected priorities shaped as much by geopolitics as by curiosity. At the same time, it would be misleading to dismiss the space race as purely militaristic. Many scientists genuinely believed in the value of exploration and discovery. Research conducted under the banner of spaceflight led to advances in material science, computing, telecommunications, and medicine. Satellite technology transformed weather forecasting and global communication. Astronauts themselves often spoke of a desire to expand human knowledge, not to serve military agendas. This tension between intention and application sits at the heart of the space race. The same rocket that carried scientific instruments into orbit could be used to refine missile technology. The same tracking systems that monitored spacecraft could guide weapons. The Soviet side reflected similar contradictions. While Soviet propaganda emphasized peaceful exploration, its space program was tightly controlled by the military. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of Soviet rockets, worked under secrecy, and his designs served both civilian and military purposes. The R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik was also the world's first operational ICBM. Soviet archives released after the Cold War show that space achievements were closely linked to defense planning and internal power struggles. Prestige abroad and security at home were inseparable goals. As the 1960s progressed, the space race accelerated, reaching its climax with the Apollo missions. But even as astronauts walked on the moon, the underlying question remained unresolved. Was this the culmination of scientific ambition or the most elaborate display of Cold War rivalry ever staged? The answer, as the evidence suggests, lies somewhere in between. Scientific progress and military competition were not opposing forces. They were intertwined, shaping each other at every stage. To understand the space race fully, we need to keep both realities in view, recognizing how fear, power, and idealism coexisted in one of the most defining struggles of the 20th century. As the 1960s unfolded, the space race became increasingly institutionalized, woven into the bureaucratic and strategic machinery of both superpowers. What had begun as a reaction to Sputnik now evolved into a sustained competition with clearly defined political objectives. In Washington, space policy discussions were rarely confined to NASA alone. They flowed through the Pentagon, the State Department, and the intelligence community. Memos circulated weighing the diplomatic impact of launches, the psychological effect on allies, and the message sent to non-aligned nations. Space had become a language of power, one spoken in orbits and payloads rather than troops and tanks. This raises another important question. If space exploration was primarily about science, why was it discussed so frequently in the same rooms where nuclear strategy was debated? One of the clearest examples of this overlap can be seen in the development of reconnaissance satellites. Officially, early satellites were framed as scientific experiments, studying the Earth's atmosphere or testing communications. Yet behind the scenes, both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to place eyes in the sky. Before satellites, intelligence gathering relied on high-altitude aircraft like the U-2, which carried enormous political risks, as demonstrated when a U-2 was shot down over Soviet territory in 1960. Satellites offered a solution. They could observe missile sites, troop movements, and industrial facilities without violating airspace in a traditional sense. Declassified American documents later revealed how crucial these systems became to strategic stability. By confirming each side's capabilities, satellites reduced uncertainty and, paradoxically, lowered the risk of surprise attack. Still, their primary purpose was unmistakably military. The public, however, was rarely told this. In the United States, programs like Corona were classified for decades, while the narrative of peaceful exploration dominated media coverage. This dual-track approach allowed governments to reap military benefits while maintaining a civilian image. The same pattern appeared in the Soviet Union, where secrecy was even more rigid. Launch failures were hidden, cosmonauts' deaths went unacknowledged, and the military nature of many missions was never disclosed. This selective transparency shaped public understanding, reinforcing the idea that space was a realm above earthly conflicts, even as it was being used to manage them. Meanwhile, the Moon program gathered momentum. Apollo was not merely a scientific endeavor. It was a national project on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, technicians, and contractors were mobilized. Entire industries were reshaped to meet its demands. Supporters argued that this investment advanced science and inspired a generation. Critics, even at the time, questioned whether the resources could be justified. Senator William Proxmire famously derided some space spending as wasteful, while others argued that funds should be directed towards social programs. Kennedy himself, in private conversations, appeared ambivalent. He reportedly suggested that if the Soviet Union were willing to cooperate on a moon mission, the United States might reconsider going it alone. This willingness to share what was supposedly a symbol of national prestige suggests that the moon landing was less about exploration for its own sake and more about geopolitical positioning. On the Soviet side, the story was more fragmented. While the USSR achieved many early firsts, including the first satellite, the first human in space, and the first woman in space, it struggled to match the scale and coordination of Apollo. Internal competition between design bureaus, limited resources, and shifting political priorities undermined its lunar ambitions. Some historians argue that the Soviet leadership ultimately concluded that the cost of beating the United States to the moon outweighed the benefits. If the moon was a battlefield, it was one the Soviets chose to abandon quietly. Yet even this retreat underscores how the space race functioned as a strategic calculation rather than a purely scientific quest. At the same time, cooperation in space began to emerge, complicating the narrative of simple rivalry. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by both superpowers, banned the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit and declared space the province of all humankind. On the surface, this appeared to mark a shift towards peaceful use, but the treaty also reflected mutual self-interest. Both sides recognized that weaponizing space could destabilize deterrence and provoke uncontrollable escalation. By agreeing to limits, they sought to preserve strategic balance. Peace, in this case, was not an abstract ideal, but a practical necessity. The Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 stands as the symbolic peak of the space race. Neil Armstrong's words about a giant leap for mankind captured the universal aspirations attached to the moment, yet the geopolitical context was impossible to ignore. The United States was embroiled in the Vietnam War, facing domestic unrest and international criticism. The moon landing offered a rare unifying achievement, a reminder of American capability and purpose. Global broadcasts ensured that this message reached every corner of the world. Some scholars have noted how carefully the event was staged to emphasize peace, including the Plaque declaring that the astronauts came in peace for all mankind. The choice of words was deliberate, aimed at contrasting the image of exploration with the realities of Cold War conflict. Still, beneath the symbolism, the military connections remained. Apollo technologies fed into missile guidance systems, re-entry vehicles, and command and control research. The Saturn V rocket, though never weaponized, demonstrated lift capabilities that had clear strategic implications. Knowledge gained from navigating deep space informed later developments in navigation and targeting. Science and security continued to advance together, each benefiting from the other's progress. As the 1970s approached, the intensity of the space race began to wane. Budget cuts, shifting priorities, and changing public attitudes reduced the appetite for grand gestures. Yet space did not become any less strategic. Instead, its role became more normalized. Satellites were integrated into everyday military planning, communications, and surveillance. The dramatic competition for firsts gave way to a quieter, more routine exploitation of orbital advantage. In this sense, the space race did not end, it simply changed form. Looking back, some historians argue that the space race functioned as a safety valve. By channeling rivalry into symbolic and technological competition, it reduced the likelihood of direct military confrontation. Others contend that it merely extended the arms race into a new domain, normalizing the idea that space was another arena for power projection. Both interpretations find support in the evidence. What is clear is that scientific progress and military competition were never separate tracks. They were two sides of the same historical process, each shaping the other's direction and meaning. This complexity challenges the comforting narrative of space as a purely noble endeavor. It does not diminish the genuine achievements of scientists and astronauts, nor does it deny the real benefits that emerged from space research. But it does suggest that these achievements cannot be understood in isolation from the strategic fears and ambitions that drove them. The space race was born in a world defined by nuclear anxiety, and it carried that legacy with it into orbit. By the early 1970s, the space race entered a new phase that further blurred the line between scientific cooperation and strategic calculation. The headline moments of rivalry had passed, but the infrastructure built during the competition now shaped global power in quieter, more enduring ways. Space was no longer just about proving who could reach higher or farther first. It had become an essential layer of modern warfare, diplomacy, and economic influence. This transition forces us to reconsider the legacy of the space race. If its most lasting impacts were embedded in military systems and geopolitical leverage, can it truly be separated from its Cold War origins? One of the most significant developments of this period was the normalization of satellite dependency. By the early 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union relied heavily on satellites for communication, navigation, early warning, and intelligence. Military planners increasingly viewed space assets as critical to national survival. Early warning satellites, designed to detect missile launches, became central to nuclear deterrence strategies. Their existence shortened decision-making timelines, but also reduced the risk of miscalculation by providing confirmation rather than speculation. Paradoxically, this meant that space technology, born from fear, contributed to a more stable balance of terror. Yet this stability came with new vulnerabilities. As reliance on satellites grew, so did concerns about their destruction. Both superpowers quietly explored anti-satellite weapons, testing systems capable of disabling or destroying objects in orbit. These tests were rarely publicized, but internal documents show that military strategists were deeply concerned about space becoming a future battlefield. The irony is difficult to ignore. The same domain officially declared a peaceful commons was simultaneously being mapped for conflict. Some historians argue that this restraint, the reluctance to fully weaponize space, reflected lessons learned from the Cold War arms race. Others suggest it was simply a matter of practicality, that attacking satellites risked cascading consequences no one could fully control. Against this backdrop, symbolic cooperation took on greater significance. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 is often cited as a turning point, the moment when former rivals shook hands in orbit. Official narratives framed it as a triumph of détente, proof that space could unite rather than divide. The image of American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts working together carried immense symbolic weight. But even here, strategic considerations were never far away. The mission allowed both sides to test docking systems, life support compatibility, and joint operations, knowledge that could be applied to future missions, civilian or otherwise. Cooperation did not replace competition, it coexisted with it. Meanwhile, the rhetoric surrounding space exploration began to shift. In the United States, the end of Apollo forced a reevaluation of goals. The Space Shuttle program was introduced as a more economical, reusable system, designed to make space access routine. Publicly, it promised scientific research and commercial applications. Privately, military planners saw enormous potential. The shuttle could deploy and retrieve satellites, conduct classified missions, and demonstrate rapid launch capability. Documents later revealed that some early shuttle requirements were shaped directly from the needs of the Department of Defense, including payload size and cross-range capability. Once again, civilian and military priorities converged. The Soviet Union followed a similar path with its own shuttle program, Buran, motivated in part by fears about the American shuttle's military uses. Soviet analysts speculated that the shuttle could be used to deploy weapons or capture satellites, prompting them to develop a comparable system. This mirrored earlier patterns in the space race, where perceived threats drove investment as much as actual capabilities. The result was a cycle of action and reaction, even in an era nominally defined by reduced tensions. At the same time, scientific exploration continued to produce genuine breakthroughs. Space probes explored the outer planets, deepened understanding of the solar system. Earth-observing satellites revolutionized meteorology and environmental science. These achievements complicate any attempt to reduce the space race to a simple proxy war. The motivations behind funding and policy decisions may have been strategic, but the outcomes often transcended those intentions. Scientists working on planetary missions were rarely thinking about missile guidance or deterrence, yet their work was made possible by infrastructure built for strategic reasons. This interdependence makes it difficult to assign a single motive to the space race. Another dimension often overlooked is how space exploration functioned as soft power. For both superpowers, success in space was a way to influence global opinion. Newly independent nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America watched these achievements closely. Space became a symbol of modernity and progress, a demonstration of which system, capitalism or socialism, could deliver technological advancement. Aid programs, educational exchanges, and media narratives reinforced this message. Space achievements were woven into broader efforts to win hearts and minds, expanding competition beyond military alliances into cultural influence. This raises an important question about agency. Were scientists and engineers merely instruments of state power, or did they shape the agenda themselves? The answer appears to be mixed. Many scientists actively lobbied for space programs, emphasizing their potential benefits. They framed exploration as a universal human endeavor, often sincerely. Political leaders, in turn, adopted this language when it suited their goals. Over time, these narratives took on a life of their own, influencing public expectations and policy decisions. The result was a feedback loop in which strategic interests enabled scientific work and scientific success justified continued strategic investment. As the Cold War drew toward its later stages, the legacy of the space race became increasingly visible. Space-based systems were integral to modern warfare, from precision-guided munitions to global communications networks. At the same time, international cooperation expanded, culminating in projects like the International Space Station. This dual legacy reflects the contradictions at the heart of the space race. It produced tools for both conflict and collaboration, surveillance and discovery. Some historians argue that focusing on whether the space race was scientific or military misses the point. They suggest that it was a product of its time, shaped by a world in which technological progress was inseparable from national security. In such a context, science could never be entirely neutral, yet this does not mean it was meaningless. The space race expanded the boundaries of human knowledge even as it served strategic ends. Looking back, the question may not be whether the space race was about science or military competition, but how these forces interacted to produce outcomes neither side fully anticipated. The rockets that once symbolized nuclear fear now carry satellites that underpin global communication. The rivalry that once divided the world also laid the groundwork for unprecedented cooperation beyond Earth. Understanding this complexity allows us to move beyond simplistic narratives and see the space race as a mirror of the Cold War itself, a period defined by contradiction, ambition, and the uneasy coexistence of idealism and power. By the mid-1970s and into the 1980s, the space race had evolved into a more complex, multi-layered contest where technology, politics, and strategy were intertwined like never before. What had started as a vivid symbolic struggle between two superpowers now took on subtler forms of competition, but the stakes remained high. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were acutely aware that dominance in space was inseparable from military, economic, and diplomatic advantage. Satellites provided intelligence, enabled global communication, and supported navigation systems that could underpin both civilian and military operations. In many ways, the space race had matured from dramatic firsts into a continuous strategic infrastructure, silently shaping the global balance of power. For the United States, the shuttle program represented the most visible embodiment of this transition. Announced in the 1970s, the shuttle promised to make space more accessible while demonstrating sustained technological leadership. Its design reflected dual objectives, supporting civilian research and enabling defense missions. The ability to deploy reconnaissance satellites, repair existing orbiters, and retrieve objects from space meant that the shuttle had significant military applications, even as NASA emphasized its peaceful scientific mission. Public messaging emphasized international cooperation, technological achievement, and scientific progress, yet declassified documents reveal that strategic planning remained central to the program's development. Budgetary allocations, technical specifications, and scheduling often prioritized national security goals alongside science. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursued its own dual-track strategy. Although the USSR's lunar ambitions had stalled after the early setbacks in the 1960s, Soviet space engineers shifted focus to military satellites, long-duration stations, and reusable launch vehicles. The Mir program, for example, combined civilian, scientific, and military purposes, testing life support systems, microgravity research, and surveillance technology simultaneously. Like the United States, Soviet planners understood that space achievements served as a marker of technological capability, signaling to the world and to their domestic population that the USSR remained a global power. Here again, science and strategy were inseparable. During this period, space also became a key instrument in global diplomacy. Satellite technology allowed superpowers to communicate more effectively, monitor arms control agreements, and observe compliance with treaties. The 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the SALT I negotiations relied on space-based systems to verify compliance, making technology a cornerstone of diplomacy. Space achievements, therefore, were both symbols of national prestige and practical tools for reducing uncertainty in a precarious nuclear environment. In this sense, science became a mediator in the Cold War, even as it was born of competition. However, the symbolic aspects of space could not be ignored. When Soviet cosmonauts launched long-duration missions aboard Salyut stations, or when American crews prepared for shuttle flights, global audiences watched. Each mission sent a message about technological competence, political organization, and the promise of progress. For emerging nations, these demonstrations suggested which superpower could deliver innovation and stability. Space had become a stage where ideology, science, and power converged. Both sides recognized that the perception of capability often mattered as much as capability itself. Education and public engagement also played a crucial role. In the United States, the Sputnik crisis of 1957 had triggered a wave of investment in science education, from improved curricula to scholarships and research grants. By the 1980s, this effort had produced a generation of engineers and scientists, many of whom would directly contribute to space programs and defense systems. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, specialized institutions and academies trained personnel to support both scientific and strategic objectives. In both cases, education became a long-term tool for sustaining technological and military advantage, ensuring that the outcomes of the space race extended far beyond immediate missions or headlines. Yet despite these achievements, fundamental questions remained. To what extent were scientific goals subordinated to strategic imperatives? Declassified reports, memos, and engineering plans suggest that military concerns influenced priorities at every stage, from research funding to mission planning. Decisions about which satellites to launch, which experiments to conduct, and which orbits to pursue were frequently guided by considerations of national security. Even high-profile exploratory missions could not escape these pressures. The very infrastructure of space exploration was inseparable from military planning, illustrating that progress in space was simultaneously progress in power projection. Another dimension of the later space race was technological spin-off. Many innovations initially developed for strategic purposes found broader applications. Material science, electronics, computing, and telecommunications all benefited from investments intended for satellites, rockets, and astronautics. Even navigation systems designed to support military operations later enabled civilian GPS applications. This interplay highlights a paradox. While the driving force behind much of space development was competition and security, the byproducts often served global scientific and commercial communities. In other words, military objectives inadvertently propelled human knowledge forward. International collaborations increasingly complicated the narrative. Beyond the Apollo-Soyuz mission, cooperative projects began to emerge between other nations, including joint satellite programs and scientific exchanges. These partnerships often relied on technology originally developed for strategic purposes, but they promoted transparency, trust, and shared scientific advancement. Space had evolved from a theater of rivalry to a platform for negotiation, experimentation, and global diplomacy. Yet the shadow of competition remained. Each collaborative mission was carefully calibrated to ensure that sensitive technology or strategic advantage was not compromised. Culturally, the space race left an enduring impact. The imagery of astronauts, rockets, and orbital stations entered public imagination, inspiring books, films, and art. This cultural production reinforced the idea that space was a realm of wonder, exploration, and progress, even as governments continue to use it for strategic ends. The space race thus created a layered reality. Public perception emphasized curiosity and achievement, while political and military actors navigated a high-stakes contest with real-world consequences. By the late 1980s, it became increasingly clear that the space race, while initially framed as a struggle for scientific supremacy, had been inseparable from military competition from its very inception. Rockets were weapons before they were vessels. Satellites were tools of intelligence before they were instruments of discovery. Budgets were justified in the name of progress, but often allocated for security. Yet at the same time, genuine scientific advances and technological breakthroughs emerged from this environment of rivalry, producing benefits far beyond the original strategic intentions. Ultimately, the later stages of the space race illustrate a persistent duality. Military competition provided the impetus, funding, and urgency that drove space programs forward, while scientific exploration offered legitimacy, inspiration, and tangible progress. Neither aspect can be fully understood without acknowledging the other. The story of the space race is therefore not one of simple opposition, peaceful science versus militarized strategy, but a complex intertwining of ambition, fear, and innovation that reshaped human capability and perception alike. As the 1990s approached, the space race had formally ended in the dramatic, headline-grabbing sense of Apollo versus Sputnik, but its consequences continued to shape human civilization in profound ways. The immediate rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union gave way to a more interconnected global approach to space, yet the legacies of competition remained deeply embedded. Satellites now formed the backbone of communications, commerce, navigation, and defense. Early warning systems, reconnaissance platforms, and missile tracking networks developed during the height of the space race remained central to strategic calculations even after the Cold War thawed. In many ways, the space race never truly ended. It evolved into a quieter, systemic competition for technological superiority and influence, one that continues to affect international relations today. One of the most revealing aspects of this evolution is the continued entanglement of military and civilian purposes. The GPS system, for example, began as a military navigation tool, essential for guiding missiles and coordinating global operations. Today, it underpins billions of civilian applications, from smartphones to aviation, yet its foundation rests firmly on strategic imperatives developed during the Cold War. Similarly, satellite imagery that once served exclusively military reconnaissance purposes now support agriculture, disaster management, climate science, and global mapping. The dual-use nature of space technology highlights a recurring theme. The pressures of competition accelerated progress, producing benefits beyond the immediate strategic goals. Science and military ambition, it seems, advanced hand in hand. Even symbolic gestures, once the hallmark of the space race, retained political significance. International collaborations, such as the International Space Station, reflected both cooperation and subtle competition. Partner nations negotiated access, expertise, and technology transfer, balancing mutual benefit against national interest. For the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada, participation became both a badge of technological prestige and a tool of influence. Yet the historical backdrop of competition remained, shaping priorities, risk assessments, and even the design of hardware. While the overt confrontations of Apollo versus Soyuz were over, the underlying strategic calculus, the need to demonstrate capability, control resources, and project influence, persisted. Looking back at the early years of the space race, it becomes clear that the same rockets capable of reaching the moon were born from weapons programs. Wernher von Braun's work, the Soviet R-7, and early missile guidance systems all originated with the goal of projecting military power. Even as rockets lifted satellites and astronauts into orbit, they carried with them the knowledge, infrastructure, and organizational culture of strategic competition. This dual heritage complicates our understanding of the era. It is not enough to celebrate lunar landings and orbital achievements without acknowledging the military context in which they were conceived. At the same time, it would be misleading to reduce the space race solely to a militarized contest. Genuine scientific curiosity and human ambition played critical roles in shaping the missions, experiments, and technological advances that defined the period. The moon landings themselves encapsulate this tension. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's historic steps were undeniably a triumph for humanity, yet the broader objective, the decision to invest vast resources in a lunar program, was deeply intertwined with the desire to assert geopolitical superiority. Internal memos from NASA and the White House reveal that Kennedy and his advisors were acutely aware that the symbolic victory could yield domestic unity, international prestige, and strategic leverage, all while avoiding direct military confrontation. The moon became a surrogate battlefield, a stage on which technological and ideological prowess could be demonstrated safely. In this sense, the line between exploration and competition was never clear-cut. Each informed and reinforced the other. The influence of the space race extended far beyond superpower capitals. Developing nations observing these milestones began to see space technology as a marker of modernity and capability. Investments in science and education were framed in the context of technological competition, and aspirations to launch satellites became intertwined with notions of national pride and global positioning. Space became a platform not only for scientific inquiry, but also for signaling competence, ambition, and independence. In this way, the space race shaped not just the military and scientific landscapes of the superpowers, but the global imagination, inspiring generations to pursue careers in science, engineering, and aerospace. Yet the space race also illustrates the inherent ambiguities of technological progress. While competition accelerated innovation and infrastructure, it carried enormous costs, economic, environmental, and social. Massive public funds were allocated to projects that, while delivering long-term benefits, competed with pressing domestic needs such as education, healthcare, and poverty alleviation. The same systems that enabled scientific discovery also reinforced military hierarchies and capabilities. This duality underscores the complexity of judging the space race. It was neither wholly noble nor entirely strategic. It was a layered phenomenon in which ambition, fear, and ingenuity were inseparably bound. Ultimately, the space race forces us to confront the intertwined nature of human aspiration and geopolitical rivalry. Scientific progress cannot be viewed in isolation from strategic pressures, nor can military competition be understood without recognizing the technological and imaginative possibilities it unleashed. Rockets that carried nuclear potential also carried instruments of discovery. Satellites designed to monitor enemy missiles now track climate change, map our oceans, and connect billions of people. The same rivalry that risked escalation into nuclear war inspired humankind to leave the Earth for the first time, forever altering our perspective of our planet and our place within the cosmos. In reflecting on this history, we return to the questions posed at the beginning. Was the space race primarily about human curiosity, or was it a theater for Cold War rivalry? Could scientific achievement ever be disentangled from strategic competition? The evidence suggests that these forces were never separate. The space race was a complex, multi-dimensional struggle where ambition, ideology, technology, and power intertwined. Its achievements were real, its consequences profound, and its motivations layered. Understanding this duality allows us to appreciate both the risks and the rewards, the competition and the collaboration, and the enduring legacy of a period when humanity looked to the stars while standing on the edge of nuclear fear. The story of the space race is a reminder that history is rarely simple. Great achievements often emerge from complex, sometimes contradictory motivations. Rockets, satellites, and astronauts became instruments of both discovery and deterrence. By examining the interplay of science and military competition, we gain a richer understanding of how human ingenuity and geopolitical ambition can shape not only the present, but the trajectory of civilization itself. The space race was, in every sense, a product of its time, a collision of imagination, strategy, and the relentless drive to reach beyond the boundaries of Earth. A struggle that continues to influence our world today.